First of all, I want to thank you, Mary, for inviting me to do this and for everybody for joining today. When Mary first asked me to do this, I said I've done presentations before, but I've never led a webinar, and I tend to talk with my hands. So I said, how are people going to understand me if they can't see what I'm saying? And on that note, if there's any questions or anything you need clarified as I'm talking, feel free to type in the question. If it's a clarification, if it's a general question, I would ask that you wait until the end of the presentation and I'll answer questions at the end. And also you can contact me afterwards if you have anything you think of later on. As Mary said, my name is Marne Coit. I'm a partner and co-owner of Greenfield Research and Consulting. We provide research and information in environmental and agricultural law and policy. My background is in agriculture and food law and policy, and the areas I work in are sustainable agriculture and food systems. So it could be any legal or policy issue related to those areas. And I have done some work with nonprofits in the past. A lot of that work has been on a volunteer basis, and a few years ago I was living in Arkansas, and I had the honor of being a board member on a very new nonprofit called Appleseeds Incorporated. And the mission of Appleseeds is to support local food systems in Northwest Arkansas and also to provide nutrition education, particularly for school children. And so some of the projects that we worked on, some of the projects that we worked on were starting a school garden in one particular school, bringing the kids on field trips, such as the farmers markets or to some of the local farms. And like I said, we were very new, and it was a working board. There are 9 members, and I put in maybe 10 to 20 hours a month as a board member on average. And after about 2 years, we got to the point we thought we might be ready to hire some staff members, and we thought we'd be getting more funding in, and we were moving in that direction. And I ended up on the personnel committee because we wanted to set some policies in place and do some research beforehand so that when we were ready to hire somebody, we were ready to go. And as I started researching these areas, the more nervous I got, and the more I realized that we had a lot more work to do. So that's some of my background with nonprofits. And one other thing before we get started is I just want to be clear that during this webinar I'll be providing information, and I've obviously done some research for this, but this isn't to be interpreted as legal advice. If you need legal advice, there are other places where you can go, and I can provide resources if you need. But I just have to say that. Okay, and this is just a overview of the topics that we'll be covering. So a little bit of background about nonprofits and how they are organized. We'll talk about board of directors, and we'll talk about employment issues, and finally volunteer management. So I just have a few questions before we get started. I was wondering how many people are currently working with a nonprofit in some capacity?
So this is the chance, if you have worked with a nonprofit in some capacity, go ahead and click your green check mark.
Okay, so about half of you, or more than half, I guess. Is anybody thinking about starting a new nonprofit or working on starting a new nonprofit right now?
Again, yes would be the green check.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And of the people who are working with nonprofits, how many people are working with organizations that deal with food, farming, or agriculture? Mary, we know you are.
There's a lot of them.
Okay.
A couple of us. And I know Lisa is as well, she just checked us. So. Okay.
Okay, and the final question is, how many people are in Vermont?
At the moment?
Live in Vermont? Okay. Because some of what I'm going to be going over is general information, and then there are a couple of Vermont-specific things that I have in my presentation. Thank you. So first, I just wanted to go through a little bit about what a nonprofit is and how you organize it, and this will just be a brief overview of that. A nonprofit is generally a formal organization of people who are committed to a particular purpose, and it's organized for the greater good of a defined community. Nonprofits do not distribute profits unlike other business structures, and they don't have shareholders. There are two types of nonprofits in Vermont. The first is a public benefit nonprofit corporation. This is what we typically think of as a charity. And the reason I have it starred here is this is typically what people think of when they think of a nonprofit, and this is what we're going to be focused on today. And a public benefit nonprofit can obtain 501c3 status, and that's the status that you obtain through the IRS, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. For example, hospitals, public libraries, the nonprofit I was working with in Arkansas, those are all examples of a public benefit nonprofit corporation. And the second type is a mutual benefit corporation, and this is not a charity, and they cannot obtain 501c3 status. I put in this third type of organization just because I thought it'd be good for people to be aware that it's out there. This is a pretty new structure. Vermont was the first state to come up with this. It's a low-profit limited liability company. It's also called an L3C, and it's a mix of nonprofit and for-profit. So it's a combination of the two. And again, we're not going to focus on this, but I just wanted people to know that this is out there. So nonprofits are created first at the state level. One of the first steps you would do, or you would take, is to create the bylaws and create a board of directors. In Vermont, you have to have at least 3 members on the board of directors. And the next step would typically be filing the Articles of Incorporation with the Corporations Division of the state of Vermont, and then finally paying the filing fee, which is $75. So it's a pretty easy process in some ways. Obviously, there's a lot of organizational work beforehand, but in terms of the legalities of forming it, it's not difficult. And then the second step, if you do want to apply for tax exemption from the IRS, you do that after you form at the state level. And this is, again, what the most common is a 501c3. So now we're going to talk about the board of directors. So who has served or is currently serving on the board of directors of a nonprofit? If you want to check the box again. Okay.
And if you'd like to, I know some boards that are looking for people. Oh, whoops.
Or volunteers, I'm sure. So the general rules in Vermont, you have to have a minimum of 3 board members, and generally they're 1-year terms that the board members will serve unless it's specified otherwhere in the Articles of Incorporation or in the bylaws. Board of directors can be compensated financially, and if you create committees within the board of directors, for example, I was on the personnel committee of this nonprofit that I was working with, you have to have at least 2 members, which makes sense. And also, Vermont law states that one person can hold more than one position on the board of directors, with the exception of president and secretary. That has to be 2 different individuals. Also, the public benefit nonprofits, which is the one that we're focused on, only 49% or fewer people can be financially interested persons, according to the Vermont statute. That means they've received compensation for work for the organization within the past 12 months. And this does not include the payment that you can receive for being a director. So the 2 types of people that this covers are people who are directly financially interested and also the relatives of financially interested people. So something to keep in mind, the laws, the statute that is in place in Vermont, if you think of that as sort of a backup document, if you will. So if you put certain terms about how your nonprofit is going to be run into your articles of incorporation or your bylaws, that's going to be the rules that your organization will follow. If you don't have those terms in there, some of those will be filled in by Vermont law. So there's certain standards and duties that board members have to abide by. They have to act in good faith. They have to act with the care of an ordinarily prudent person in a similar position. They have to act in the best interest of the organization, and of course they have to act according to the bylaws. So conflict of interest comes up sometimes when you're working on the board of directors. An example of a conflict of interest would be if somebody's going to benefit financially. That's a typical situation. So if somebody has a direct or an indirect interest in a transaction that the organization is going to get involved with. And the conflict of interest can be waived as long as that board member discloses their conflict or that particular conflict and it's approved by the board in good faith, you can waive it. So generally, and this is very general, if you follow these standards and duties that I listed above, board members won't be liable for the actions if for some reason there is some wrongdoing and they're sued for some reason. Board members won't be liable. In terms of risk management, it's probably a good idea to develop a written conflict of interest policy, and I highlighted that here. At first I just wrote you should develop a conflict of interest policy, but it's really important to have that in writing because that way it's very clear to everybody, and also if something does happen later down the road, you can always go back and see exactly what was listed. One of the things about having something in writing is in the future, people can remember things differently, and if you have it in writing, it's exactly as it was, exactly as it stated. You can also purchase directors and officers liability insurance, and this probably won't cover bodily injury or property damage if that occurs, but it can cover actual or alleged wrongful actions by directors and officers. So I don't have this in here as a poll question, but I'm just curious, how many people have heard of directors and officers liability insurance? If you want to check the box. Okay. So in terms of employment issues, has anybody been responsible for hiring an employee? If you want to check, well, I guess Mary, do you have to clear those? Okay, and has anybody been responsible for firing an employee? I kind of want to ask which one was more fun, but I won't do that. Thank you. So I wanted to go over some terms that are used in relationship to employment law. The first are employment contracts. So these are written contracts that the two parties, the employer and the employee, will agree to. And there can be different terms in an employment contract. For example, it can state the length of employment. It can clarify the responsibilities of each party. And if you don't have a written employment contract in the state of Vermont, you're considered an at-will employee. An at-will employee means basically either party, the employer or the employee, can end the employment relationship at any time for any reason, or as I've said here, for no reason. Employee handbooks, these are obviously a written document, and they can be considered a contract, or they might be considered a contract, unless the handbook has a clear disclaimer saying that it is not an employment contract, which an employer can put in there. For employers, it's typically a good idea to have an employee handbook. Again, it's one of those areas where if you have something written down, there's less chance of a miscommunication later on, and it's easier for both people, or if there are more than two people, to know exactly what's expected and exactly what both parties expect from the other. And if you're an employee, it's a good idea to read and understand the employee handbook if there is one. So another area is employee versus independent contractor. And there's no clear rule about that says whether you're an employee or an independent contractor. Rather, it's a list of factors. And this is something that courts have come up with, and it's a balancing test. So they'll look through all of these factors, and if you fall more on the side of an employee or you fall more on the side of an independent contractor, that's how they'll decide what you are. And this is actually very important. There are tax consequences to knowing whether you're an employee or an independent contractor. So some of the factors are the degree of control over the work. So for example, if somebody has a lot of control over your work, you're more likely to be found to be an employee as opposed to an independent contractor. The other factors are which party paid for material, supplies, and equipment, the type of skill required for the work, if there's a degree of permanence to the work. And again, if there's a degree of permanence, you're going to fall more into the side of being an employee, and whether the worker is an integral part of the business, which again would favor being considered an employee. So here I just put a little more detail. If you're an employee, it's more likely that you rely on the business for income and that you have less control and independence over how you work and the type of work that you do, your hours, all of those things. And the tax implications are that the employers will pay the state and federal unemployment tax, Social Security, and workers' compensation. If you're an independent contractor, you retain a much greater level of independence. You're not eligible for benefits. The work tends to be more temporary. There's a greater ability to set your own hours. And the person you're working for has a lot less control over how the work is done. So moved on to the hiring process. Employers can't discriminate for all of these reasons that I've listed, race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, national origin and ancestry, place of birth, physical or mental disability. And it's illegal to discriminate in these, based on these categories, whether you're advertising for an open position, during an interview, and in hiring or in refusing to hire an individual. Employers also can't discriminate based on citizenship. And they can perform credit checks, but again, if you're an employer and you're going to perform a credit check, you need to notify the applicant in writing. Employers may require a medical exam. However, this information must be confidential unless it's needed to make an accommodation for a disability, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in a little bit. And if they do require a medical examination, it has to be required of all applicants in the same job category. So, for example, if I'm applying for a job and 3 other people are applying for the same job, and we all have an offer of employment based on a medical examination, the employer can't require just one of us or just myself to get an exam and not the other 3 people. You have to do it. You have to treat everybody the same. And also the employer will pay for that medical examination. Employers can also require drug tests, and again, they have to provide written notice to the applicant if they're going to do this. And employers can also conduct criminal background checks, and this is something we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about volunteers. So if an employee is asked questions about a criminal background and they answer dishonestly, and then they're hired, that can later serve as a basis for termination. And as I mentioned before, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is particularly important if you're working with children or elderly or other people who are considered to be vulnerable populations. And something else to consider, your application and resume, those have to be truthful, and the information in there has to be truthful, or that can also be the basis for termination if you're hired. So a little bit more about disabilities. a disability can be a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activity. So you can see some of the examples here: walking, hearing, seeing, caring for oneself. All of those are considered life activities. So a potential employer cannot ask about disabilities during an interview, and that's really important to keep in mind. And I'm sure it's something most people have heard before. An employer also can't request a medical exam before a job offer is made. Once a job offer is made, then an employer can request a medical exam, but again, only if it is done for everybody in that same job category. And if somebody is hired, the employer can't request a medical exam or ask about disabilities unless it's specifically related to the job and it would affect how that individual performs in the job or is able to perform the job. So on the employee side, if you are hired and you have a disability, you are allowed to ask for a reasonable accommodation. And employers don't have to provide the accommodation if it would constitute an undue hardship. So for example, an undue hardship could be a financial hardship if the cost is too high, and especially if you're talking about a nonprofit and it's a small nonprofit and they don't have a lot of financial resources, this might come into play. So an accommodation could be different computer software. It could be the desk setup if you need a particular kind of keyboard or chair or something of that nature. The employee can also provide the accommodation him or herself, or they can contribute to the cost of whatever that accommodation is, whether it's, like I said, software or a different desk setup. And once an employee does ask for an accommodation, then the employer can require a physical exam, and they can also ask questions about the disability, and they can require documentation about that disability. So moving on to payment. Under federal law, minimum wage applies if you have at least 2 employees, you're engaged in interstate commerce, meaning you're doing business across state lines, and you are also engaged, you're also conducting more than $500,000 worth of business a year. And right now the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And this is one of those areas where federal law says if there's something different in the state law and their amount is higher, you go with the state law. And in Vermont, in fact, it's $8.15 an hour. And the minimum wage applies if you have at least 2 employees and they don't look at the amount of business. So this would probably apply to most nonprofits. The Federal Equal Pay Act requires that there's equal pay for men and women doing substantially equal jobs. And the actual job title doesn't matter. It just means as long as the job itself is substantially equal, that there should be equal pay. And employers can choose how often they want to pay wages. Typically it's once a week, every other week, or twice a month. And it is up to the employer to determine how often they're going to pay. But if they do decide to change the pay period and they go from once a week to every other week, they have to give the employees notice. And employers will deduct from your payment federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security, and Medicare. So some about employee benefits. There's something called Parental Leave, and it applies to mothers and fathers. And it applies whether you're pregnant after the birth of a child or within 1 year after the adoption of a child. You have up to 12 weeks per year that you can take as parental leave. It is unpaid time. Your employer or the employer can decide to pay some of that, but they're not required to. And in Vermont, this law applies if you have 10 or more employees who work an average of 30 or more hours a week, and that particular employee who wants to take leave has to have worked there for at least 12 months. So with 10 or more employees, I know some nonprofits are very small, so this might not apply to them unless they reach that the number 10 in terms of employees. There's also family medical leave. This is time off for serious illness of either the employee or somebody in the employee's family. So it could be a spouse, it could be a child. I believe they also say that it could cover in-laws And again, it's up to 12 weeks per year, and you don't have to take those 12 weeks consecutively. And the same factors apply in Vermont. So the 10 or more employees working an average of 30 or more hours, and the employee must have worked there for at least 12 months. And for both of these types of leave, the employee must provide written notice to the employer. So here's a little bit more about employee benefits. Employers are required to provide military leave, but they're not required to pay the employee during this time. And employers are not required to provide health insurance or time off for voting. And they may provide paid vacation or pensions, and obviously they may provide health insurance. That's up to the employer. And once again, if the benefits change, the employer needs to provide notice to the employee. So privacy issues, personnel files in Vermont, they belong to the employer, and employers are not required to give access to employees. You don't necessarily, as an employee, you don't necessarily have the right to look at your personnel file. In terms of terminating employment, just keep in mind if you're an at-will employee, either party can terminate the employment relationship at any time for any reason. If there is a written contract, there will probably be rules or procedures written into the contract about termination, the steps that have to be taken before termination, or what would be grounds for termination. And so if those are written in the contract, those rules have to be followed. And again, an employer can't terminate employment based on any of those protected categories that we talked about earlier. And something to keep in mind, if you're an employee, if you're an at-will employee without a contract and you decide to quit, you won't be eligible for unemployment insurance. So now we're going to get into volunteer management, and this is something that that's close to my heart, I would say, because that nonprofit that I worked with in Arkansas, we were dealing primarily with kids, and as I started doing the research, I realized maybe we didn't have all of the policies and information in place that we needed. So that started to make me a little bit nervous. So for those of you who have worked with nonprofits, do you know if those organizations had a written volunteer policy? And if you want to check the box. Okay. And by the way, the picture of the balloon on here, that has absolutely no relevance to the presentation. I just knew the material can be a little bit dry, and I figured at this point people might want something fun and colorful to look at, so I threw that in there. So as a nonprofit, of course, a lot of times you depend on the work of volunteers. So I don't know how many people think about the risks and responsibilities that are associated with having volunteers, but after I started looking into this for the organization that I was working with, I think it's a very good idea to start thinking about some of these things. So one thing that could come up is liability for that if there's some harm that comes from an act of a volunteer. So for example, if somebody is physically injured due to some action that the volunteer has taken. And again, this is especially important if you're working with certain populations like children or the elderly. So from the nonprofit's perspective, there's a possibility that you could be found liable for negligent hiring. And something a court will look at is whether the nonprofit conducted a reasonable investigation into the fitness of a volunteer. And this would also apply to paid staff. Did you take reasonable steps to look at their background or get some information about that particular person? In other words, did the nonprofit know or should they have known that the volunteer's conduct would lead to an unreasonable risk of harm to a member of the public? And on the volunteers side, there is a federal law that was put in place, I forget what year it was, to protect volunteers from liability. And basically what Congress found was they want to encourage people to volunteer and do good work, and they didn't want the risk of liability to keep people from participating in this way. So there are certain factors that you have to meet to fall within the scope of the statute. So for example, if you're acting within the scope of your responsibilities, in other words, if you're acting within the range of what that nonprofit said that you can do, and the harm was not caused by criminal misconduct or gross negligence, and also that the harm was not caused by a motor vehicle. And there are some limitations to this law. For example, it doesn't apply if the act that caused the harm constituted a hate crime, if it was a violent crime, a sexual offense, or if the volunteer was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So what happens if a volunteer is injured while acting on behalf of the nonprofit? The nonprofit organization could be responsible for medical expenses and or damages for negligent supervision of whatever that activity was that the volunteer was injured doing. So in terms of risk management, this is what I was mentioning before. It's a good idea to have a written volunteer policy. Again, it shows that there's some consistency and that you're applying the same rules and procedures to all of your volunteers and not just, you're not applying it randomly. And it would also show that you're taking some precautionary steps. So it's a very good idea, I think, to have a written policy in place. You can also have an application form for volunteers. And I have to say, I'm not sure that any place I've ever volunteered at has done this. But again, once I started doing more research, this made a lot of sense to me. So at the minimum, have information about that person's identity, have their name, have their address, phone number, email. That seems like a very basic minimum step to take, but I think some people overlook it. You can also ask if they have any health issues, what their qualifications are for that particular volunteer position, what their time constraints are, or how much time they're willing to commit, whether it's per week or per month or per year. And also you can ask for references. So in some ways this is looking at volunteers almost like you're hiring an employee, and you want to make sure that you've taken reasonable steps to make sure that that person is, I want to say, fit and responsible enough to act on behalf of your organization, because remember, they're representing your organization when they're working with members of the public. You can also have a volunteer job description. So again, this is like hiring an employee. So if you have a job description for an employee, you can have something similar for volunteers. And this will help to clarify what exactly the volunteer is permitted to do, what they're authorized to do by the organization. You can also have a screening procedure in place for volunteers. And again, if you're working with particular populations like we were with Appleseeds, you can consider doing a criminal background check. Again, you can ask for references, and you can ask for addresses and employment going back a couple of years. And one of the things that I read said the reason you'd want to do that is to see if there's a lot of, if somebody's moving a lot or changing jobs a lot, and if that might be a red flag. And again, there are privacy issues involved with doing a criminal background check, so it's a good idea to notify the applicant that you're going to be doing that, or applicant or volunteer. It's a good idea to notify them that you're going to be doing that, and also to obtain written consent. You can also consider doing an orientation program for volunteers. Again, this would be similar to hiring an employee. You can go through the history and the mission and purpose of the organization. If you have a confidentiality policy, you can go over that with them, drug and alcohol policy, anything about a dress code. If there is a dress code, you can clarify expectations in terms of what you consider to be appropriate behavior. You can have policies on discipline and termination. Again, it's like parallel with what you would do with an employee. I know a lot of people don't think about disciplining or terminating volunteers, but as a nonprofit organization, you do have the ability to do that. So if somebody is not acting in your best interest, or if for some reason there's something that they're doing that you don't agree with, and they are acting on your behalf, you can implement discipline and termination policies. So finally, this is the same as with employees. If you do have certain procedures in place, you have to apply the same procedures across the board. So you can't apply them to one volunteer and not another. It has to be applied to everybody. And I believe that is the last slide. Here are some additional resources. If you're looking for more information about labor law or some of the Vermont statutes, there's also a good resource. The fourth one down, the Vermont Bar Association has a good resource on employment law if you're interested in learning more about that. And they have some other good information online, and that's all free and available to the public. That's my legal disclaimer.
Great. Thank you, Marty, very much. And I will give people a chance to type in some questions if they have questions, and I've got a few questions here already. So are you ready for questions?
I think so.
Okay. I know that we're sort of treading this line here between education and legal advice, so just, if you can't answer, you can't answer. But in terms of conflict of interest policies, I heard you say that they should be written, but are there guidelines for what to include or what not to include, or?
I'm trying to think if I'm trying to just go through in my mind and think if I've read any good resources about exactly what you should put in there, and I can't think of anything. Not off the top of my head, no.
So, but basically, I'm guessing whatever you put in there, you better be prepared to follow as a board.
Absolutely.
Once you write it, it becomes your law.
Correct. Those are your rules.
So then I have another question about employee handbooks, and I think if I understood you correctly, you said that if an employee handbook does not specifically state that it's not an employment contract, then it could be interpreted as such. Is that true?
If the employee handbook generally can be considered a contract for employment, unless they have a specific disclaimer and they're saying this is not, in fact, an employee contract and should not be construed as an employee contract.
Okay, so that's a pretty important bit of information to have in the in the handbook then.
Correct.
So if it's not there, and if it were interpreted as a contract, but it doesn't have an end date, does it? Is that?
No, not typically, because so it would apply to all of the employees in the organization. So unlike a regular contract that's written for an individual employee, it's not going to state a term of employment necessarily. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Yes. So it makes me think that I need to go back and check a couple of employee handbooks for organizations I've been working with quickly. Okay, so Ellen, I see Ellen has posted something here about at-will employment.
I'm not sure. Oh, wait. I don't know how common it is. It's going to be up to the employer, and something to keep in mind. There aren't a lot of rules that are different in terms of employment law for nonprofits versus other organizations. A lot of this applies to all kinds of business organizations. And in terms of how many nonprofits have at-will employees versus contracted employees, I don't know the answer to that.
So, and then now I have a benefits question.
Mm-hmm.
Do all the employees in a similar position have to be awarded the same benefits? I guess the example that I'm thinking of is a condition where you have somebody who's not making a ton of money, is doing incredibly good work, and has actually been very loyal to the organization and stuck around a while, and the organization or the board wants to reward that person with some benefit. but there are other people who haven't been around as long, but technically do about the same work. So does everybody have to get the same benefit?
A benefit in terms of a bonus, a benefit in terms of if you're providing health insurance to one person and not another person?
I don't know.
They're different.
Does it matter? Oh, okay.
Because I think there are different kinds of benefits also.
Okay.
You know, the ones that I'm talking about are, if you're talking about health insurance or something like that, my understanding is you'd have to provide that for everybody. Okay. But if you're talking about a benefit like a financial incentive or a financial bonus on
like paid vacation or something like that, could you have that?
You know, I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. You know, if we can go back, the last resource here, the Vermont Department of Labor, that might be a good organization to check with.
Okay. All right. I will be happy to go back and check on that. And then I have another question on ADA compliance. And I know that you said that an organization doesn't have to provide an accommodation if it's I can't remember what the phrase you used was, but if it's basically if it would be a financial hardship for the organization was basically the essence of it. So my question is sort of what constitutes too great a financial commitment for an organization?
That would be based on that would absolutely be a case-by-case basis. So it would depend on the organization. It depends on what their resources is. I think it's one of those things in law where there's not a bright line where you can say, okay, this is absolutely what it would be and this is how it's defined.
So who's the decider? I mean, who makes that call?
If you end up going to court.
Well, before that. Or is there no before that?
You know, for example, the organization that I was working with in Arkansas, like I said, it was a working board. All 9 of us did a lot of work, and we were applying for grants. We weren't getting a lot of those grants, and at the same time, we were working with kids. And what I came back and said to the group was, look, we can't necessarily afford to do. I forget how much the background check was on each person in the board, and then if we did it for all of our volunteers, we might have made that decision as a board. We would have discussed it and weighed the pros and cons. But I said at a minimum, even if it's something we can't afford to do, at the very least, there's no reason we can't have a written policy in place about volunteers. That doesn't cost us any money. That's reasonable for us to do. So we at least have to have that policy in place. And also at a minimum, why in the world have we not been getting contact information for our volunteers? We're working with kids. It's a very easy step to take. Again, it doesn't cost a lot of money. You're getting name, contact information, address, and maybe some references. That wouldn't be an economic hardship for us as an organization. But if, God forbid, something happened to one of the kids we were working with while we were working with them, then a court could go back and look and say, okay, look, they did take reasonable steps considering their financial resources, as long as we had that policy in place and we took those reasonable steps. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Because it does cost a certain amount of money to do a full background check.
Right.
And so if you did that for all of your board members and all of your volunteers, that could really add up. So it's just something to take into consideration.
So do these compliance issues apply to volunteers as well?
Which compliance issues?
The ADA stuff and needing to provide accommodations.
I don't believe that they do. But if you want to be nice, obviously you can do that if you want to.
I do want to be nice. So, okay. Well, does anybody else have questions that they want to post or ask? Or I'm sort of going down the list here of things, both my questions, personal questions, and questions that got posted to me.
Well, and again, if anybody has any questions, they want to contact me after this. My email address, well, you can find me through my website, which is greenfieldrc.com, and my email address is mcoit, MCOIT, at greenfieldrc.com.